This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a cartoonist whose work has appeared in numerous publications, including The New Yorker, Prospect Magazine, and The Wall Street Journal. Today we'll be discussing his second book, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, A Tyranny of Truth, a graphic biographical portrait of the great 20th century Jewish German philosopher, which has just been published by Bloomsbury Publishing. Ken Krimstein, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Welcome.
So how did the idea to write a graphic book about Arendt even come about?
I knew about her just from in passing as the normal, as I sometimes say, the normal NPR listener. You know, I knew Banality of Evil, but I didn't quite understand it. It was a name that was around origins of totalitarianism, and she had a large presence, but I wasn't really a student or scholar, although I have a history degree from Grinnell College. But I was looking to find a way to take complicated ideas, philosophy, something like that, and see if I could do it in pictures to communicate it. And so I was poking around, and I was also interested. I'd recently moved back to Chicago, and I know she taught at the University of Chicago for a while, so I was looking at the philosophy department there and other people. And when I opened her biography, there was so much about her that I didn't know. Her childhood, her father dying of syphilis, the way she taught herself ancient Greek, it just kept going. The Weimar period, the filmmakers working with kids, and then sort of this almost Casablanca-ish escape. And it just went on and on and on. And I was smitten with her character. And I thought, wow. And she was attractive, and the environments were attractive. And I thought, if I could tell this story of this person, it would be just fantastic. And
yeah, because it's more a biographical portrait and actual engagement with her philosophy. I mean, it's both, but it's mainly a focus on her life and her personality rather than her ideas.
Well, I felt that the ideas come from the life, and I think in her philosophy, action is thinking too, thinking and speech. So I've always been curious with artists, and even say, take the Beatles, like what made their music so great in their biographies. And so I read it and read it and read it. So I thought what was the life that led to the thought? I wanted it to be together. I wanted it to be birthed together.
Can you give us an example or two about an idea that is born out of her lived experiences or her personality?
Yeah, I mean, I think she starts to understand about phenomenology, as I understand it, that the immediate experience is what counts. And as she moves on, she starts to understand that action is something that is the only thing that is of value in the world. And eventually this causes her to feel that sort of contemplative philosophy, when you're just sort of, for lack of navel-gazing, isn't really going to work for her. And she becomes more and more engaged in what you might call the political space or the political world, while valuing her private life, to the point where sort of late in her career, she actually sort of renounces philosophy and says, I don't count myself as a philosopher, which was a question that kind of was another thing that pulled me deeper into it. Like, why would somebody who is clearly such a great thinker and is considered a great philosopher renounce philosophy? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I could see that struggle was something that animated her story.
And how do you translate it into, visual and into drawings?
Well, first of all, I had to find a way to draw her that could show her aging over time, which is really tricky. I mean, if you notice, Charlie Brown never ages. He's brilliant. He's a genius, but Schultz. But
neither does Bart Simpson.
That's true. It's a good trick. So I had to find out how to make her consistent yet growing through time. And there were some things I did. I discovered the green was a color that she liked to wear. I exaggerated her eyebrows, and almost every drawing of her from the age of 12 on, she's smoking, which is pretty much what I think she did. But how do her ideas grow in there? So for instance, when you're doing a comic, you have so many different palettes to play with in terms of storytelling. I can have the talk bubble and the scene, which is just like seeing a movie. I can have a little narrative bar that sort of sets the scene and they're playing against it. Or I can do some stuff with duplication. So one of her ideas, and I was just kind of waltzing around reading her ideas, and one of her ideas was that you can't be alone in the world, but you can be solitary. But when you're solitary, you have a dialogue with yourself. So I could split her into two people having like an argument with herself, two versions of herself arguing with herself. So I think I was able to illustrate the ideas a little bit, demonstrate them using some of the tricks of drawing that the comics medium allows you to do.
Do you find that it does justice to the really complexity of her ideas, of life story? After all, drawing pictures, comics is a simplification in one way or another.
I would say it's a complication.
Uh-huh.
A picture is worth 1,000 words. And, I see the world and I understand the world through pictures. I think maybe as humans, we initially comprehended the world through images. Our eyes are probably our most acute sensory organ. We can tell people from 1,000 feet away, almost, their expression. So I think what I kind of discovered as I was doing this, was that geography is almost destiny. The setting that you're in the moment, which kind of works with their philosophy, so much defines the feeling that's going on. So I think, for instance, it starts out with her thinking, and then we see Königsberg, which was destroyed, but we see it, as I saw pictures, the city in Germany, which is now Kaliningrad, which is really just north of, which is sort of in the Baltic states.
It's Eastern Prussia.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's right up there with Latvia and all that. It's right there. And, I've not been to Kaliningrad. I wanted to try and go there, but it's a Russian submarine base or something, and it's rather difficult. But I have been to Amsterdam, and I saw pictures of it, so I was trying to show this lost world. And when you show that, or the Café Romaniche, for example, which is in Berlin, these types of settings complicate the story a little bit because they're so immediate that you're thrust into it, and then you have to kind of pull back, as we as humans in dialogue and action. Like, we can dissemble in speech, but you can't dissemble in what you see. I mean, you sort of can. Magicians can. But generally, what you see is what you get.
And this is, you think, it really is the added value of cartoon, of a graphic book, to the hundreds of books and dissertations and pieces of research that have been written about her. I mean, what were you trying to bring to the table? Maybe make it more accessible to a wider audience, or? Well,
I wanted to bring her. So, it's a difficult question because it's not an academic biography. I don't know, and it's not a heavy philosophical treatise. But, one of my very good friends is a philosopher, and I like philosophy. I took it, and I sort of feel like philosophy is supposed to be something that we should be able to use in life. And sometimes when you get down into, even in Arendt's work, it can be rather gnarly. I mean, it circles in on itself. She's not the most linear thinker, but it's certainly engaging. So I felt like I was almost a translator, and I also felt that this isn't really her. This is a character called her who lived basically all the same stuff that she did and kind of thought. But I got so into her character that I almost could anticipate what she was going to do. So what am I trying to bring to the party? I'm trying to bring her back into the public arena, or at least her thinking, as a provocation. And it's interesting, the more I read, she made a speech in the 50s when she won the Lessing Prize, and she was the first Jew and the first woman to go back to Germany and win this prize. And she talked about Lessing as a provocateur, like she liked to throw thought grenades out into the world. So I wanted them to be back into the world as a provocateur, to get back into the debate.
Mm-hmm. Is it something that, that's a novelty for you? Have you tried before to take its grand personality or a complex idea and turn it into a graphic novel? Is it something that you do?
I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking when I thought I could do it. But when I was a kid, I inherited a bunch of comic books from my great uncle called Classics Illustrated, and the comics aficionados may not think they're that great, but there were some parts of them that were really terrific, and they handled sometimes fiction and sometimes nonfiction. And I've done some studying on it, and the people who made it, typical New York Jewish comic book scene, were very interesting. The woman who was the head editor. So I was always taken with the idea of telling historical narrative. Then I discovered, I love film. I saw Werner Herzog, what he did with The Gary Wrath of God and some of his nonfiction films. And it emboldened me to think that she's a person, she's a thinker, the ideas have to come out of her life. I would think even with the most esoteric person, if you can kind of figure out where was the breakthrough, where was the aha moment in there, that's what I'm trying to show. And it did require, I don't think simplification, because I read and cross-referenced a lot of things, but reduction, boiling down.
How many drafts?
I've got boxes of them at home. I saved them all.
Mm-hmm. Which were, why they're in the box and not printed on the paper?
I had to find the way in to the story. It was really, really hard. And I say, as I was working on it, Hannah's biography, and I'm sorry I refer to her as Hannah, so you can tell I'm not a real biographer, because I got to know her so well. But I felt like I was getting so into it that she was giving me gifts at times when I would get jammed. So she's very, very complicated. But then there was this escape from the Gestapo in the 30s when she was translating Nazi documents into ancient Greek. I mean, the stuff was just so rich. And then she escapes from Marseille with Varian Fry, and Walter Benjamin is like her great friend, and he doesn't take the visa and perishes by his own hand, but hands her a draft of one of his greatest works on the thesis of the philosophy of history, which I had to read over and over and over again to kind of understand, but I felt that I could, because I feel that if I teach myself this, I can teach it to other people. So these happened, and then lots of things, the green color, and then I found this terrific biography written by her student called For the Love of the World by Elizabeth Young Brull, which is absolutely chock-a-block with these incredible details. And spoiler alert, but I don't think it spoils it, there was an incident toward the end where she goes to a graphology was a very big deal in those days. And, you can tell someone's character from their handwriting. So I started dipping into it. And at some point, not only are people like Aristotle and Walter Benjamin really into it, but Hannah Arendt gets into it and goes to where Young Brull got this story, I only wish she were still around, goes to I envisioned it as a literary cocktail party in Manhattan, where the wife of Strauss, the great German publisher, has become a graphology expert. And Hannah Arendt is part of this with total seriousness. I won't give away much more than that, but I'm thinking, what is this ultra-rationalist, non-sentimental person doing, putting down old letters and asking for people? I mean, so these came through, and I didn't know about a lot of things. Quite frankly, this may shock your audience. They may not believe it, but I didn't really know that much. I mean, I had read a little bit about the Heidegger, he was a Nazi, this, that, and the other thing. And I'm sorry to say that. I mean, it's just, I have a cartoonist's knowledge, But I got into it, and then I didn't know about the affair, and I didn't know that people like Levinas and all these other people studied with Heidegger, and I didn't know a lot of this. So as I learned it, it was quite exciting to me.
Do you see it as also an educational product, to help others who don't know much about her undergo the same kind of process that you did?
I think it can't help it. I mean, I teach college-level courses. I teach at a university writing and things like that, and I found that a lot of the students that I have really don't know very much about history.
So who's your target audience here?
Oh, everybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's because she's fascinating and her thinking is fascinating, but, even people. So one of the things that I've learned from reading these people like Walter Benjamin and people like that is that they have this counterintuitive way of looking at history. And they don't really want to do a narrative that is this, things are getting better and better and better and better over time. They feel that you have to look for little obscure things in the past and make them into like a collage. And out of that, then you can understand the past better. So I use a lot of footnotes. I call it sort of an homage to David Foster Wallace and how much reading his books used to upset me because of all the footnotes. So I thought I'd pass that annoyance on. But the thing is when I'd come across people in her world, Hannah Hoch, I never heard of her. This was a German Jewish woman photographer who invented mashup, collage. I didn't even know who she was, so people should know. There are people who may not know who Fritz Lang was, or who, Peter Lorre. And their stories, so I use it almost as a breaking the fourth wall, and I had some fun with it.
It's also a collective portrait of a generation, of a certain intellectual circle.
Yeah, I was discovering, as an American growing up in the 70s and 80s, I joke, but Germany did not exist as a country in America. And I joke and say, even Beethoven was American. Come on, da-da-da-da. Only an American could have written that. And it was just taken out of our culture. So
because of the past?
Because of the past.
Was it Germany specifically or any other country except America?
Oh, I think it was more Germany. I think when I grew up, there were still a lot of people who the Germans, it was not where I grew up. Maybe not, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. And I started dipping in and, like we read Shakespeare and we might have gotten to Voltaire, but we certainly never got to Goethe, or we never got to Lessing. We never got to any of these writers. And I saw this world, this incredibly vital world where scientists and philosophers and filmmakers, and I've loved Billy Wilder's movies. And then when I started to study it, and I've always been a big movie fan, I can understand Love in the Afternoon is the most dark, sinister story, and The Apartment is that bitter acid humor. I needed to know where it was coming from. And when I saw these connections, it was just catnip. And somehow or another, Hannah Arendt always found herself at the front table in those settings.
Tell us a bit about the three escapes. The book is divided into 3 episodes, more or less.
Yeah.
And why did you choose to frame the story around those?
Well, so when I started, I knew I would need some help. So I went back to my Aristotle and looked at the Poetics, and he said, do things in 3 acts. Well, I've written my share of failed screenplays like every other writer and failed sitcoms. And the 3-act structure is there for a reason. And I thought it would work. So, the first escape, as I mentioned, she escapes the Gestapo. She's thrown into a Gestapo prison in 1933, just after the Nazis take over. And she's translating anti-Semitic articles from the German press into Greek. And she gets caught. She talks her way out of this prison. And she says of the guard, he had a nice face. And the Jewish community of Berlin is so guilty that she got caught. They send one of their top lawyers in, and she sends that lawyer away. She says, I've got this. And anyways, you guys screwed up. So I love this character. So that's the first escape. Her and her mother, she grabs her mom and very quickly exit stage left to Prague and then to Paris without passports. And she's stateless for 18 years. So she really gets to understand what it's like to not have a passport and all the red tape. She goes to France, and again, you just have to listen to what happened. She's not Hannah Arendt yet, by the way. She's just a smart, struggling Jewish girl with her mother and her second non-Jewish husband. And it's like, whoa, what's going on? So she's working for this group called Jewish Aliyah, and this is before the war, and she's trying to get all sorts of Jewish kids out of France, and then she's doubly damned because she's German. So when France starts fighting the Germans, she has to go down to a detention camp. Then when France effectively loses and the Germans take over, well, she's Jewish. So, but in that moment of confusion, it's in the historical records. So she just says, guys, let's go. Nobody knows what's going on. And I put myself into that moment. And it's like, would I have the courage? Because the police are saying, stay, it's going to be okay, we're the police. And she says, what part of this equation don't you guys understand? And she leaves. The third escape, well, I needed the third one. And I only had 2. And I didn't want it to be anything contrived, but I felt that there was I had this internal question. How did she deal with Heidegger's lack of acknowledging his past? And I looked at a lot of the letters, and I looked at a lot of her responses. And also, how did she deal with living after what she called the abyss and the break in tradition? And again, as a writer and as a ecstatic truth teller, as a chronicler, as Benjamin and Herzog would say, I have to inhabit it myself to see what it feels like. So I was in New York on 9/11. Not only did I understand what it must have been like in the Blitz in London, where there was utter confusion reigning. But I remember America. I mean, I would say that America there was a little mini abyss, not on the same level by any stretch, but on September 10th and on September 12th, things changed completely. So I think she had to come to grips with how can you live, not how can you write poetry. And she wasn't a really great friend of Adorno. So I love a little bit of the squabbles, and I think you can tell I like ideas. I think they're like jazz music to me, and I like to see how they play, and I like to see if there's some kind of connection or beauty in them. And I think I'm not saying that she was perfect, nor would she. And sometimes she backtracked on her own thinking. But she was a provocateur, and I think she tried to face reality as best she could. So the third escape is, how does she get on? How does she get on, after all, after the abyss?
Did you ever think about writing it, co-authoring the book with perhaps a philosophy professor or an expert? Or do you think that this fresh look on that oft-told story is really what is the main benefit?
Well, I spoke to a lot of people who are, former students of hers who have written a lot of books about her. I wouldn't have gone ahead. I had them vet a lot of this. People like Jerome Cohn and Roger Berkowitz and others. And I've actually had people, it wouldn't have been the book that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell a book about a person who had a life, and the way she expressed herself in the world was through thought in the public space. Now, she was a very private person, and I was thinking about this as I was coming over here, and someone asked me about it at one time. She was so private, yet you're showing her private life. Would she have liked it? Well, this is a character. It's not her. She was a wonderful person. Love her. Sorry, she died in 1975. I mean, she was amazing. I would have given anything to meet her and hang out with her. I talk to people who have. This is about her persona in the world.
Is it an exercise that's been done by other cartoonists, or are you a trailblazer in this sense? I mean, can we even look at perhaps an incipient subgenre of graphic books about philosophers?
Well, there was one written about Bertrand Russell called Logicomics that was done by some Greek people, Greek writers. Great, tremendous book about Bertrand Russell. I didn't know about it. There are others. There have been books written about James Joyce and other people like that. So, yeah, I think dealing with history or biography in the comic form. I mean, what's happened, I think, in comics, it's really exciting, is people understand that pictures are language and as are words. And what cartoonists do, what I do, whether I'm doing a cartoon in the New Yorker or a sketch, is it's always got to have that content, even if it doesn't have words in it. It's telling us a narrative in a way. It's a story. One of the things that really empowered me, this was a gift that I got from Arendt very early on. She had a great quote. She says, "Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it." And wow, I love that. That freed me.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other similar books in the pipeline?
Oh, that I'm working on? Yeah, I'm very excited.
I mean, have you gone in this direction now? Is this like...
No. I love the idea of using this as a tool to chronicle history and give people a voice and a picture, because when you see them in their environment talking, there's something very direct about it. But it has to be the right thing. So I'm going to try and do something. There was recently a discovery of about 175,000. It's appropriate as we're sitting here in YIVO, because they were instrumental in this. The YIVO, or the original YIVO place that was in Vilnius, had done a massive ethnography in the 1930s to try and figure out what Jewish teenagers in the Pale of Settlement, in the Yiddish-speaking world, were like. And it was pretty much a couple of them had been found, but many were lost. And within the last couple of years, about many of these anonymous autobiographies have surfaced. And sometimes we can find the people who did it, and they're breathtaking. Because YIVO, in its typical YIVO-ish style, said, no prizes will be given for flowery writing. And the prize was the grand sum of 150 zlotys, which I'm trying to ascertain, but I think it was about a year's rent for people. So it was not insignificant. And I have had a few of them translated, and I went to Vilnius, and they're breathtaking. And they're giving voice. I'm trying to inhabit. Geography is destiny. It's a great story.
So what are really what is the essence of those stories? Can
well,
tell us
what I'm
in
trying so again to
form?
go back to the 9/11 metaphor, which obviously was my second son's first day of kindergarten, so it really implanted itself on me. These are people on 9/10. Mm-hmm. Because in one of the great ironies, the grand prize was to be given on September 1st, 1939. They didn't get around to giving it out. Obviously, that was the day that the Germans invaded Poland and the war pretty much started. So this is truly a window into a world that is not in my mindset. I want to, print the legend, but the legend has to have truth in it. I don't dissemble. One of the things in a Hannah Arendt book, I didn't do the kind of Hollywood thing of like maybe, putting people in after they were dead or, everybody had to happen in the right order, and the people had to legitimately be able to have seen each other and been alive and in the vicinity at the time when it happened, if it wasn't an exact story that I got from a letter or from something like that.
And is there any visual or artistic technique to convey that, or do you just let the story tell itself? I can tell you as a writer of words that the best stories that I've ever written are those that wrote themselves. Is that similar in your trade?
Well, it's very interesting. I tried to work the story out to a fare thee well. Thus, all those boxes and note cards and wrestling and throwing out false leads. I mean, here I'll tell the world, or at least the world listening to the Tel Aviv Review. My initial way in was I wanted to have an imaginary confrontation on a Orient Express card between Irving Berlin and Hannah Arendt, because I'm fascinated by Berlin, but then it was just an extra wheel, so I had to throw that out. Thinking about that, I found I had to get the story right. Once I pretty much got the story right, and I had to do some sketching, the wonderful thing that happened, first of all, I figuratively had a gun to my head in terms of a deadline. Nothing focuses you like that. But when I started drawing, I realized I had been rehearsing the pictures the whole time. So they unfolded, and it was almost as if my hand started to move by its own.
All right, Ken Krimstein, the author of The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, A Tyranny of Truth, a graphic biographical portrait of the great 20th century philosopher. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much.